second delay, so I think that's why it kind of just spins its wheel for a while. It's not there, but it is here.
Okay.
Now, that being said, I don't know if this part of the conversation is going to end up on the live stream, but here we go. So if you are watching the live stream or the recording, welcome. Glad to have you here. Today is the second of 5 sessions on the history of Lutheranism, the history of the Lutheran Church, all that good stuff. Last week, I almost said last year. It's been kind of a long week, but not that long of a week. Last week, we covered kind of the origins, right? So, or I guess in a lot of ways we didn't cover the origins. We skipped over quite a bit of the actual Reformation section of the Reformation history. We covered the 16th century. So kind of the movements that Lutheranism took in its fledgling and early years. We primarily focused on how Lutheranism kind of really began centered around the University of Wittenberg and spread out from there largely through publishers and through the common language of academia and all of that. Lutheranism spread primarily up into Scandinavia and some of the neighboring countries there. And we saw at the conclusion of, well, it was not quite the conclusion of the century, but it's the conclusion of kind of the main narrative thrust that we took. 2 different peace agreements that were reached. The first was that peace that came after the Diet of Speyer, which is very early in the Reformation history. That peace, of course, was revoked. And then the one that we're still working with at the beginning of the 17th century is, of course, the Peace of Augsburg. Does anyone remember what the Peace of Augsburg kind of concluded with? This is the check for understanding.
The Augsburg Confession?
Not the Augsburg Confession, right? It's related. Right. The same city is involved.
Okay.
Your prince is your religion.
Right. Whoever is in charge of you, whatever he is, so are you. With 2 exceptions, right? The exception was for Catholic monks and Protestant knights. Why those were the 2 exceptions? Like I said, I'm certain that there's a reason. I didn't bother to find out what that reason was. But what we will make very careful note of is, I said here, Protestant princes. Well, as far as the Peace of Augsburg was confirmed, there was only one Protestant group, and that was the Lutherans. There were no Calvinists. There was no one else, at least that was recognized here. This is going to become majorly into play over the course of the 17th century. So, at the conclusion of the 16th century, you had Lutherans and Catholics living alongside each other, kind of not happy with each other, but the let bygones be bygones, right? There's disagreements, there's still tension and conflict, but we've reached an agreement on kind of how to move forward. Unspoken, but in this mix, are, at least in the continental aspect of Europe, which is really what we're going to be dealing with. Especially in this century, are the Calvinists. You got Calvinists running around utterly unrecognized by the Catholic Church, by the Lutheran Church for that matter, and by all the governing authorities. Now, Switzerland and Geneva is a little bit of an exception, but I mean, for just about all of European history, Switzerland's just doing its own thing as an exception, so we can just ignore them for the most part. But basically, you have 3 parties, 2 of whom are recognized. You have Catholics and the Lutherans, and then you have the Calvinists kind of floating around that don't really have a place in the Peace of Augsburg. So, this drives us into the 17th century. Now, I've mentioned to a few of you already, but this is in the process of writing this, right? I had this really great little point in my outline. It says, a very brief overview of the war. This is the 30 Years' War. That is going to be the primary thrust for this whole century, but especially for the first half of what we're going to talk about today. My thought was that this very brief overview would be about a page of my notes. It is 4 of my 6 pages that we're going to go over. Basically, the 30 Years' War is an enormously complicated and convoluted conflict. right? But before we kind of dive into what's going on in the 30 Years' War, what do you know about the 30 Years' War? Go ahead, Grant.
Got the phone guy now. And
It's not a good Friday sermon, so that doesn't count. But, you know.
isn't that the Crusades?
No.
Darn it! I thought it was.
The Crusades have, by this time, the Crusades have been over for a few centuries at this point. Unless you're my crusading history professor who was utterly convinced, mostly because he was making a case for himself beyond his normal means, that World War I could even be classed as a crusade. No. I mean, there was some sort of crusading, vague sentiments in certain areas, but no, World War I could not under any circumstance be considered one of the Crusades. The Crusades actually conclude with the fall of Acre, which is not on my list of Ottoman expansion. So the fall of Acre is, I believe, in the 1300s. So the Crusades last from about the 1100s to the 1300s, at least in the Holy Land. You do still have crusading orders doing stuff. They're probably about concluded by this time up in the north, fighting what we call now the Russians, although they were the Novgorodians at that point in time. And that's what the Teutonic Order is doing, the Teutonic Knights. Yes, the Teutonic Knights. But they don't really figure it. So no, the 30 Years' War is not a crusade, although there are a lot of religious aspects to the 30 Years' War. Well, it is. Anyone else want to venture anything that they know about the 30 Years' War?
30 years.
You know what? For what it's worth, yes, it actually did last for 30 years, which we all kind of chuckle about, but historians and names of wars that are time frames are not traditionally good about the time frame. So my classic example is the 100 Years' War. Lasted, Eric, for 115 or so years, right? So it was not 100 years. So it is worth saying that, yes, the 30 Years' War was actually a 30-year conflict in Europe. Now, I'm going to skip over or glance over a lot of this. It wasn't constant. There were a few times where the war pretty much went away, although not quite, and then it would flare back up with a vengeance. But overall, the conflict did last 30 years. So, before I ask for more volunteers, part of the reason I ask this is because, for the most part, no one knows anything about the 30 Years' War. My guess is if you know anything about the 30 Years' War, and this might trigger something, you know that it began with, and we'll talk about it, an event known as the defenestration of Prague. Mostly because defenestration is one of these super fun words that means to throw someone out a window. Which is just, it's so specific and it's so wonderful. And now you know that if you ever throw someone out a window, you have defenestrated them. And if you know anything else, you know that it ended with the Treaty of Westphalia. And most people, even people who do know about the 30 Years' War, that's it. By the way, if you asked me 3 weeks ago what I knew about the 30 Years' War, do you know what I could have told you? Well, it began with the defenestration of Prague, and it ended with the Treaty of Westphalia. That's it. So I didn't know much about this conflict. Quite frankly, I still don't know that much about this conflict. Hence the very brief overview of this war. I know the highlights, and that's about it. So, here's basically what's going on. We've already began to set the stage for the outbreak of the conflict. But at the beginning of the 17th century, as I said, there were essentially 3 religious groups in continental Europe. Now, I keep saying continental Europe because you got the Anglicans and the stuff going on in Europe, but they really don't figure into the 30 Years' War. Now, I will say, one of my major sources for this was an interview done with a 30 Years' War historian who happened to be English, and so he spent about 5 minutes of an hour-long podcast explaining the role of the English in the 30 Years' War, which is a long way of saying he needed to make it about the English somehow, and he was really pulling at straws to do so. But it was for the BBC, so the British had to be involved. But basically, the English are not involved other than mercenaries in this conflict. So, 3 religious groups are involved. The first is the Catholics, then there are the Lutherans, and the Calvinists. So, at the centennial of the Reformation, so that would be in the year 1617, which is 1 year before the 30 Years' War breaks out. So at the centennial of the Reformation, if someone were to be taking a bet, right? So let's say this. You get in a time machine, you teleport back to Germany, Prussia, Austria, anywhere in that area, into 1617. And you told someone a massive conflict is about to break out. There's about to be a war next year between two of these three religious factions. Who is it going to be? Everyone would have guessed it was the Lutherans and the Calvinists that were about to just go to absolute blows. Mostly because they hated each other at this point in time. And a lot of this has to do with the Peace of Augsburg, right? So again, remember, Lutherans are officially recognized. They do not have beef with the Catholic Church politically, in really any sense of the term. And not only that, but they have been given allowances by the various Catholic empires. Specifically, the one that's going to come up today is the Austrian branch of the Habsburg dynasty, or the Holy Roman Empire. Remember, they are worried about the Turks. The Ottoman threat has mostly been put down and surpassed because the Battle of Lepanto has occurred, and we're going to actually encounter one of the generals who was the admiral who was in charge of that battle, Philip II, as we go on. But the Ottoman threat has mostly been dealt with, but it's still looming large. And so the Holy Roman Empire, which is not very strong at this point in time, has made allowances to the Lutheran princes. I don't want to fight you. I want you in my corner if I need to fight them, is basically what's going on. And so, quite frankly, the Lutherans and the Catholics were on very good terms with each other, politically speaking, right? I mean, there's still, and we'll see later, there's some religious tension there. But politically, the Lutherans and the Catholics have an incredibly vested interest in playing nice with one another. Left out of that, of all these niceties, are the Calvinists. And because the Calvinists are unrecognized, two sort of things come out of this. First is, well, quite frankly, Europe is basically all Christian at this point. And so, if the Calvinists want to convert people to their cause, they're pulling from one of the two other camps that we've talked about, either the Catholic or the Lutheran branches. They were not pulling from the Catholic Church. All of the vast majority of the Calvinist conversion that was occurring was happening in Lutheran provinces. Largely because of the second reason, which is Calvinists who wanted to openly practice Calvinism began to say, we are Lutherans, right? Because they're allowed to be Lutherans. They're not allowed to be Calvinists. And so the Calvinist church started saying, we are the true Lutheran church. We are the ones who have taken Luther to his logical conclusion. We are the real Lutherans. And so we are allowed. If they could convince their prince of that, the prince would keep the title of Lutheran while pushing Calvinist theology. This, by the way, is something that will not end in this century. We're going to come back to it in a couple of weeks with the Prussian Union, of trying to make Calvinists and Lutherans play nice with each other, sometimes at the point of a sword. So, the Calvinists were trying to kind of push themselves into Lutheran circles politically and religiously. So basically, at the centennial of the Reformation, the Calvinists and the Lutherans hated each other. You can see this in their coinage. You can see this in the pamphlets that they were putting around. They absolutely despised one another, and in addition to that, the Lutherans and the Catholics had a vested interest in working together. Now, that's the religious aspect of what's going on at the outset of this conflict. Additionally, the Habsburg dynasty at this point in time is incredibly weak, but crucially getting stronger. Right? They have hit their bottom. They've hit their rock bottom, and they're starting to go back up in power and influence. They're starting to increase. This becomes actually the reason for the spark that ignites the 30 Years' War. So basically what is going on is the Habsburg dynasty, as I said, is split into two branches. Right? You have the Austrian Habsburgs, which is the Holy Roman Empire, which you will remember is not holy, nor is it Roman, neither is it an empire. Right? That's the good way to remember it. That is ruled by Emperor Ferdinand. So Charles II has passed on, he has shaken off this mortal coil. It's his two sons who are in charge of the Habsburg dynasty. One son, Ferdinand, is in charge of the Austrian branch, the Holy Roman Empire, and the Spanish Habsburgs are ruled by Philip II. As I said, he was the admiral in charge of the Battle of Lepanto that kicked the Ottomans back. So, the Habsburgs, which were united under Charles, are now separated. So that, in and of itself, makes them weaker. As I said, they have, mostly through conflicts with the Ottomans and through the mess of the Reformation, let's just say, the Habsburgs have lost a lot of their power and influence and were forced to give the princes a great number of concessions. Now they're not quite as weak, but I'm getting slightly ahead of myself here. In the background of the 30 Years' War, we need to note that the Spanish Habsburgs have been increasing hostilities as they began to get stronger with the Dutch. The Dutch, depending on who you were talking to at the outset of the 30 Years' War, are either a former or current colony of the Spanish Habsburgs. It's going to take them a little bit longer than the 30 Years' War, but war will break out between the Spanish Habsburgs and the Dutch, which will be crucial to why the 30 Years' War is 30 years rather than like 2. But we'll get there. Additionally, in the background, the Spanish are also getting ready to enter into a completely unrelated conflict with the French. So, in fact, for the vast majority of the 30 Years' War, there were 3 wars going on in continental Europe. The 30 Years' War, which doesn't technically involve the Spanish-Dutch War, and then later on the Spanish-French conflict. Convoluted mess, right? We haven't even gotten this thing started yet. The Austrian Habsburgs are the ones that were weakened the most through the Reformation, which makes sense. The Austrians are close to the Germans, right? This is the epicenter of the Reformation, which didn't significantly touch Spain. There were reformers in Spain, but they were mostly stayed within the Catholic Church, didn't leave the fold. The Reconquista and the Spanish Inquisition have something to do with that, but that is not what we're talking about today. The Austrian Habsburgs have been weakened through the political turmoil, and they are the ones who have granted quite a bit of concessions to the princes, primarily of what we call Germany now, Bohemia and Bavaria. These were not the religious concessions of the Peace of Augsburg. These are, you're just in charge, you make all the decisions in your province. We don't have the political clout or reach or strength to compel you to do what we want, so you just get to be in charge. You're in charge of taxes, you're in charge of the local militias and armies, you're in charge of all of that, but you still report to us, right? You still send some of your tax to us. That's kind of how they kept order in these kind of outlying provinces of Germany, Bohemia, and Bavaria. Beginning in 1618, they started clawing back those concessions. So to the various princes and dukes and all sorts of other titles that the people who ruled in these areas, they started to say, you don't get to choose what you're taxing. We do. You don't get to choose what you're doing with your military or anything. We do it. So they gave the concessions, they gave the freedoms, the rights to these princes, and they started taking them back once they were a little bit stronger. The taking back of rights is or from the princes, right? I mean, for most of the people, nothing changed throughout this whole process. But the taking back of rights from the princes is the spark that sets off the fire of the 30 Years' War. Because guess who wasn't a fan of that? Princes. What do you mean I can't? I've been doing this for years. I like all this extra power that I have. I'm richer than I used to be, and I didn't have to answer to you. And now you're saying, I don't get to do what I want. I have to give you all this extra money that I have, and I have to answer to you. They were not fans of this process. I'll pause here for a moment. Questions so far about the backdrop of the 30 Years' War? All right. In 1618, again, after these titles had been revoked, so in 1618, a number of Bohemian princes, and by the way, I'm going to keep checking myself because in my brain, Bohemian and Bavarian sound way too close to each other. Bohemian is the correct one here. And so in 1618, a number of Bohemian princes who had various titles and allowances that I discussed, stripped from them as the Holy Roman Empire attempted to re-centralize their control through 4 Catholic lords regents, say that 5 times fast, out a 4th-story window at the Bohemian Consulary in Prague. This is the defenestration of Prague, the throwing of 4...
they died, right?
Well, we'll get to that, actually. For these people out a 4-story window, the defenestration of Prague, officially beginning the 30 Years' War. This was an intentionally incendiary act. They did this in such a way to kind of give them a point of no return, to spark a fire that they could not back down from. It was meant to harken back to the first defenestration of Prague. By the way, this wasn't the first time, nor will be the last defenestration of Prague. There are 3 defenestrations of Prague. I don't know much about the third, or the first for that matter, but this was the same window that the first defenestration took place at, which was on purpose. The reason these princes did this is because the first defenestration of Prague sparked a popular revolt that I know nothing about, because that's not what this class is about. And so they're trying to harken back to revolutionary Bohemia, right, and kind of spark those sorts of things. I mean, I guess it would, this is the first example that came to my mind, it would not be terribly different than if someone went and tarred and feathered some IRS agents because they wanted to start another American Revolution, right? Or threw a bunch of tea in the harbor in Boston, right? Well, we're going to just table that one. These are people who are hearkening back to a revolutionary history, saying we're going to get going. Now, the intention was undeniably to murder these people, was to kill them. All four of the government employees lived through this, and there are 2 different explanations as to how they lived through this.
Was it winter when it
happened? No, I don't know
when we were in Prague, they said that they miraculously landed on a haystack.
Yes, so the Habsburgs, they argue that angels gently lowered them to the ground or through the haystack. The Protestants, which by the way, this does become a Protestant Catholic conflict at this point, religious rhetoric is used to drive the narrative forward, but the Bohemians, I should say, their argument was that the regents fell in a cart full of horse dung, and that's why they lived. So take your pick, one of the 2, angels into a haystack or the dirty government employees into a pile of, or you know what. No idea which one's true. Doesn't particularly matter. What we do know happened is 4 Habsburgs went out a 4th-story window and did not die. But the effect was sufficient. It sparked an uprising in Bohemia, where the Bohemians began what is now known as the 30 Years' War, a conflict against the Habsburgs. Questions here? This is another kind of minor stopping point. Questions about the defenestration of Prague? Good, because I told you like 99% of what I know, so I can answer a lot of questions. Now, remember, the Holy Roman Empire is starting to gain its strength back, but they're not particularly strong. They're only just beginning to come out of this turmoil. Really, the Bohemian princes were not a whole lot stronger, if they were stronger at all. In fact, neither side in this conflict was actually able to gain any sort of decisive victory. The intention was for this to be a 1 or 2 battle war, quick and over with. And both sides kind of thought that's what would happen. However, they were pretty much evenly matched and a stalemate occurred. Quite frankly, neither side really had any hope of winning this war for quite a while. And so when they were going into battle, the intention on both sides was not even to win, or at least not to win a decisive victory. Partly because neither was strong enough to win, paired with the fact that neither side could back down. The Bohemians backed down, they were toast, right? I mean, the Holy Roman Empire would absolutely make examples of them and utterly destroy them. If the Holy Roman Empire, the Habsburgs, backed down, well, now they're weak. Now, who else is going to look for even more concessions, right? And all of their princes and provinces are going to start pushing back if they back down now.
So the Habsburgs are clearly Catholic.
Yes.
Who are the Bohemian princes?
Yes. They're Protestant. They're Protestants. What brand of Protestants, I actually couldn't figure out. Now, I didn't do an enormous amount of looking into it. I get the impression that they're Calvinists, but I don't know that for certain.
Where's Bohemia on the map?
Czechoslovakia.
Yeah.
Czech Republic.
Right. Yeah. Depending on which globe you're looking at, right? Basically, so what we're going to note throughout this whole conflict, and this is kind of this incendiary statement I made at the end of last class, right? The 30 Years' War is not a war of religion, nor are there any real wars of religion, at least none that I can really think of. The 30 Years' War is a war of politics. Shocking. It's a war where princes are trying to position themselves better so that they have more power. Crusades, for what it's worth, that's a lot of, hey, we got too many second sons that don't have land. Oh, look, the Muslims have some land, and the Pope says it's okay for us to kill them, so let's just go do it, right? Not really a war of religion, war of expansion more. But the 30 Years' War is not really a war of religion either. It's a war where various princes from all over Europe, trust me, we're just getting going here, where all over Europe are vying for socio-political, geopolitical power and position over one another. Now, that's pretty boring, even for the people who you're trying to get to go kill each other, right? And so, how do you get those people who really don't care who their prince is? I mean, look, like, nationalism, certainly as we know it, does not exist. There's some elements of that, kind of, but there really is no true sense of nationalism. No one's like, I'm fighting for America or anything like that, right? I'm proud to be an American, right? None of that sort of sentiment exists at this point in time in Europe. It's starting to, a little bit, but they're not fighting for Bohemia. They're not fighting for Germany or any of these other places that we're running into. The princes are fighting each other for more power over one another. But they need to get their, right, princes don't fight wars. The poor people fight wars, right?
Rich man's war and a poor man's fight.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. There was a time when that was not actually true, but that was before Jesus. Just because if you were poor, you couldn't afford the things that you used to kill each other, right? So you had to be rich to afford the pointy things. Actually, more of the things that stop the pointy things. But so how do you get the masses under you to fight for you? There are a couple of ways, but the easiest one, especially in the century coming out of the Reformation, is to load on just absolute tons of religious rhetoric. The Catholics are coming to get you, right? The Protestants will destroy your families, right? And so God is Protestant, God is Catholic, and so you're fighting a holy war, right? And so religious rhetoric gets heaped on top of the conflict, not because it has anything to do with it. Remember, the Catholics and the Lutherans are desiring to live in peace with one another. It's working out very well for quite a while between them. But princes are having political problems, and so now throw religion on the fire, and we'll get this thing cooking, right? And so that's how they got people to fight for them. The other way, by the way, is, well, if you kill them, you can have their stuff. So money is also a way you get people to fight each other when they don't actually care who's in charge of them. Which, especially if you're having poor people fight for you, it's a real good reason to fight. But that's basically what's going on here. Is religion is used as a tool to get people to do what you want them to do. Very much. I mean, there's a very little religious impetus behind what goes on, and this actually plays itself out in the Treaty of Westphalia. We'll get to that in the end. Many people identify the Treaty of Westphalia as something that removes religion from politics, and it does to an extent, but the Treaty of Westphalia doesn't talk about religion at all. It doesn't talk about Catholics or Lutherans. It says this prince is in charge of this territory, and it's all a territory thing. And I'll tell you what, if the treaty that ends the war doesn't talk about religion, you know what the war wasn't about? It's religion. What the treaty talks about is usually at least some portion of what the actual fighting was about. And it was about politics and land and power and all that sort of stuff. Right, so neither side really had a hope of winning this war. And so when they were fighting, because they could not back down and back out of this, they were fighting for a better bargaining position when the other side had to back down. Right, so no one was really trying to win. They were trying to get the one up so that they can negotiate better terms. By the way, if you are reading World War I into this, that's like 3.5 of the 4 years history of World War I. No one can win, no one can figure it out, but if we give up now, we'll lose at the negotiations. So we got to go kill another 1 million people, right? Not that many people died in the 30 Years' War. Well, not that many soldiers. There weren't that many soldiers, but we have echoes of World War I going on here. Stalemates, fighting that it just begets fighting because there's no real solution to this problem, and no one's willing to back down, and no one can force the other person to back down. So the war began in 1618. In the year 1620, the Holy Roman Empire finally does defeat the Bohemian forces at the Battle of White Mountain. They did this by bringing the Bohemians into the conflict. Essentially, the Bohemians, which are a Catholic group, so they are already predisposed to the Habsburgs and have been allied closely with the Habsburgs. They said, hey, you bring your armies in to tip the scales, you'll get some favorable stuff, right? And the Bohemians were defeated at White Mountain by an alliance of the Holy Roman Empire and the Bavarians. That should have ended the war. For all intents and purposes, it did end the war. However, remember, the Spanish and the Dutch are fighting each other. Now, who do you think are a very close ally of the Spanish?
The Mexicans.
No.
Portuguese? No.
The Holy Roman Empire. Remember? They're brothers. The two of them have the same dad. And so, who do you think is going to get involved on the side of Spain if they're not fighting another war? It's the Holy Roman Empire. And so, who is terrified of the war between the Bohemians and the Holy Roman Empire ending?
Princess.
Yes, well, you might think the Dutch, because they're the ones that are fighting the Spanish. And yes, kind of the Dutch, but the ones who insert themselves to protect the Dutch from the Spanish, from the Austrians, are the Danish. So Denmark inserts itself because they don't want Spain to conquer their neighbors. They don't like that. They don't like Austria. They're vying with Austria anyway, so they want to pause Austrian expansion and growth. So the Danish enter into the fray on the side of the Bohemians, who have just lost, and reignite the 30 Years' War. All right. Complicated enough for you? Because we're just 2 years in.
Who
Right?
are Dane's neighbors?
The Dutch. They're both kind of...
Oh, the Netherlands?
North are together.
Yeah, basically.
Because Dane is Denmark.
Right, yeah. So we're using Netherlands and Denmark, vaguely. We're using modern day terms that don't quite apply. Remember, the Dutch were Spanish at this point, or at least they were controlled by the Spanish. Europe's a convoluted mess since, like, the Romans. The last time anything made sense in Europe was when the Romans were in charge. It really didn't make sense then, except the cities all looked the same, at least. So, to halt Spanish expansion into Dutch territory, through aid by the Holy Roman Empire, the Danes get involved in the war, fighting the Habsburgs in Austria to keep them from getting involved. Right? If you're fighting us there, you can't fight our buddies there, sort of thing going on. So again, allusions to World War I. We kind of got treaties, the secret hidden treaties are kind of happening here, although not to the extent of World War I, where, one guy in Czechoslovakia shoots another dude, and now all of a sudden France and Germany are at war, and Russia's getting involved, and all that kind of nonsense. Just powder keg ignited in World War I. Not quite that much, but we're starting to get these kind of convoluted alliances. So 1620, the Dutch, the Danes join, right? The Dutch and the Danes, the Bohemians and the Bavarians, they all sound too similar. So in 1620, they get involved. In 1629, so we're fast forwarding through 9 years, the Dutch forces, the Danish forces, that's an error on my page. The Danish forces are defeated, which should have ended the 30 Years' War. But we're at 11 years, not 30. So when the Danish forces are defeated, this prompts the Swedes to get involved. So the Swedish, well, I know, right? Imagine trying to sort all this out. It's a mess. So basically, the Swedish Empire is looking to expand. They have been expanding. This is back when the Swedes were like the most terrifying people in Europe, kind of. At least they were the boogeymen for a lot of countries because they were really good at fighting. Kind of like how Finland was to the Russians before World War II. So the Swedes get involved, and this we have.
The Vatican still uses the Swiss Guard.
Right. Oh, that's Switzerland, not the Swedes.
Oh,
These are the, I know.
Now I'm getting confused.
Too many. The names are all way too similar, right? So the Swedes get involved. They are led by one of their national heroes, Gustavus Adolphus, the Lion from the North. Who is only relevant because we have an archway at the seminary named after him. Because basically, without him, the German Lutherans, who I'm really not even mentioning in this, just get annihilated. So he comes in to protect the Danish. And by the way, all of the fighting is mostly happening in Germany, or what we would call Germany now. Because again, Germany doesn't exist. Not for another 200 years at this point. All right. Questions?
What was Germany before?
Just principalities, city-states, that sort of thing. They were Germanic. They had common ethnicity and language, but they were not unified under any... Well, the closest thing to the unifying force were the Habsburgs, who exerted influence on them. So with the inclusion of the Swedes, any questions about the 30 Years' War? Believe it or not, we are cranking through this, and we're making good progress. All right, so the Swedes joined the fray. All right, here's the skipping over part. The Danish are defeated in 1629. It takes 2 years for the Swedish to get involved. They kind of just start twiddling their thumbs and then decide that they want to get involved because they're worried about Habsburg expansion. So really they start fighting in 1631. In 1634, the Swedes are defeated by the Austrians. Again, we're running through a lot of history there real fast. Ferdinand, who remember is the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire, is extremely harsh against the Swedes during the negotiations. By all accounts, the defeat of the Swedes in 1634 should have been the end of the conflict and would have been the end of the conflict if Ferdinand was not so brutally harsh with the Swedes. By the way, still sounds like World War I. I don't know why I have this horse that I'm beating, but I'm going to, right? Because World War II started in large part because the Allied forces just beat the living tar out of the Germans in the Paris Accords, whichever one ended World War I. I'm not teaching that. That World War II would not have happened if the reparations were not so harsh on Germany. The next stage of the 30 Years' War would not have occurred had Ferdinand not been so harsh in negotiating the peace with them. He was so harsh that he got the French involved. So the French are not pleased with how the Austrians are treating the Swedes. There's more politics going on than that. And they say, no, we're getting involved. We're going to fight you too. They're also fighting the Spanish. it's a big, giant, convoluted mess, right? So in 1634, the French joined the war. The final peace is reached at the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648, right? So it began in 1618, final peace in 1648. The Treaty of Westphalia also, or the negotiations at Westphalia, I should say, also were attempting to end both of the Spanish wars that were going on between the Spanish and the Dutch and between the Spanish and the French, which makes the negotiations at Westphalia just as complicated as the rest of the war. The treaty does end the war, does end the 30 Years' War, and it also is successful in ending the war between the Spanish and the Dutch, although the French and the Spanish are still fighting each other at the end of the 30 Years' War. So, when all goes quiet on the Western Front, at the end of the 30 Years' War, they're still fighting on the Western Front if you go further west.
That's a great movie.
All right, so here's my favorite, maybe even the favorite bullet point that I've ever written in one of these classes. Are you guys ready?
Yeah.
As a summary of how convoluted this conflict was, the 30 Years' War, take the following scenario, which is a true scenario. In 1647, there was a French infantryman who was fighting the Austrians in Germany to protect the Swedes, who were defending the Danish, who were lending aid to the Bohemians against the Bavarians, because a number of disgruntled princes threw 4 government employees out of a window, by the way, some of whom were French, 29 years before.
That lived.
They did live! So, I mean, I can only imagine what was going through that French infantryman's mind, as in why in the world.
Who knows what they told him to get him to fight?
Well, it is religious.
There wasn't the internet. There wasn't newspapers. There wasn't.
Katie, thank you for saying that. What a wonderful transition. And I'm going to skip down a few, because the 30 Years' War was a massively devastating war, right? I mean, we skipped over all the battles, basically, and everything that was going on. But people were utterly terrified across all of Europe, right? From France to Slovakia, people were horrified that the conflict was going to come to them. Because it was everywhere, right? It wasn't everywhere all at the same time, but there were roving bands of soldiers that were just looting towns, and so people wanted to know, where's the fighting? Where are the armies? Am I safe? Which led to, for the first time in history, war reporting. The printing presses would send newspapers with reports of where the armies were, what they were doing, to all the towns in Europe. So, no, there wasn't the internet or news reports, but this is the first time that, if you will, the papers, there weren't really papers yet, that comes later too, but there was published war reporting. This did not happen before this, right? The army went off, everyone waved by, and then they found out what happened when they came back. Or
A messenger.
2 armies just showed up at their door, blew everything up around them, and then left. And the people were saying, okay, well, I guess there's a war happening. Right? People just, I mean, there was word of mouth and that sort of thing. But for the first time, because of the horrors of the 30 Years' War, there was war reporting. This was one of the lasting impacts of the 30 Years' War. Questions about everything we've covered so far before I kind of get into the aftermath of the war. All right, good, because I've told you everything I know. With a couple of exceptions about the 30 Years' War. This war was extremely brutal. It was an extremely devastating war. I mean, you have war in a fairly localized area, mostly Germany, although, it did spread all over the place for 30 years. Right? Just having soldiers around, not even fighting, in a localized area for 30 years is going to destroy the place. That's just the reality of having soldiers who need to eat. It's just going to happen. Fields are destroyed when the armies camp and fight and march over them. When soldiers get very hungry and there's a town with food nearby, what happens? Soldiers go take their food. Right? Because they're the ones with the pointy things. And, well, the guns. They do actually have guns in this conflict, although we wouldn't really think of them as guns.
Muskets?
Yeah.
When was the musket invented?
Before this conflict. Oh, well, actually, the musket is even after this. I mean, these are
These
tubes.
blunderbuss.
Yeah, well, not even the blunderbuss. These are, you would pour gunpowder down the
those
barrel.
entire things.
You would pour gunpowder on a plate.
Yeah.
You would have a matchstick, like a long burning fuse.
Right.
You would do this, and you'd hit the plate with it, and the whole thing would explode, and hopefully a bullet would go that way.
So mini cannons.
In fact, fighting during this era is fascinating. So the two main types of forces, other than cavalry, which is just what the rich people were riding around on. So I guess you have three. You have cavalry, you have pikemen, and you have musketeers, is I guess what we're just going to call them. The pikemen would walk towards each other, and depending on how motivated they would anywhere from really go after it and try and kill the other guys, or what is often reported, especially during the English Civil War, is they'd get about a foot away from where their pikes could reach each other, and then they'd shout a lot and wave them around and hope their officers didn't notice, and so that they didn't have to die, basically. Everyone was kind of on board with that. The guys with the guns would be on the outside, shooting until they ran out of ammo, then they'd turn their guns around and run in to hit people with them, because that's about how useful they were at that point. And then the cavalry, for the most part, was riding around yelling at soldiers to, no, actually try and poke the other guy, don't just wave and scream, and making sure the musketeers were doing what they were supposed to be doing and that sort of thing. Now, when there was actual conflict, which often it did happen that the pikemen were really going after each other, armor was sufficient. We're not talking plate armor, we're talking like high leather, that kind of thing. But the armor was sufficient that for the most part the pikes didn't penetrate. You could get lucky in a weak spot, but mostly the way infantrymen died during the 30 Years' War was getting shot with something or getting crushed. It's called the push of pike, where the two armies would essentially just, they'd have a pokey side, and then everyone would just stack up and they'd shove. And so most of the people who were dying were getting crushed to death rather than actually being stabbed or anything. Right! It is not a fun way to fight. It is extremely brutal. But that's how warfare was done at this point. Now,
It's always brutal.
yeah. Now, I mean, it's not exclusive, right? And you don't really have just massive armies, for the most part, running around. Most of the time it's bands of soldiers, anywhere from 5 to 50 men wandering around looking for someone that's not on your side to fight with, who's probably about the same size as you. Now, you do still have big, giant set-piece battles, but not really. I mean, those are rare. I don't know where I was going with this or how we were tying this back in. Basically, the 30 Years' War is extremely brutal. We don't really know what the death toll was.
How many people were on the Earth at the time?
On the Earth, I don't know. Let's see. I didn't write it down. A major city at this point, Magdeburg, which is comparable, the guy said, to like New York. Probably more comparable to like St. Louis. Like a mid-sized city.
5 million?
40,000.
St. Louis only has 40,000?
No. I'm talking in during the 30 Years' War.
National Geographic has an article, a big article, this month, about world population, and they mark 1802 is when the Earth had 1 billion people.
Right, which is
So 1600 should have to be way less than that.
right, significantly, especially because you think about all the different advancements in the 1800s or late 17, early 1800s. So again, a mid-sized city has anywhere between 40 and 80,000 people. Like that's a metropolis at this point. Again, I don't even know the population numbers, but we don't really know any of the casualty figures. Like overall casualty figures of the 30 Years' War for a couple of reasons. One of them is that the war lasted 30 years. We don't know how many people were born. So we can't say, well, here's the population of Europe roughly before in 1617, and here's the population of Europe in 1649. What's the difference? Because 30 years in between. A lot has happened. People have been born and died for completely other separate reasons, all sorts of other things. So that's one of the major reasons. I'll get to the other one, why we don't really know.
I just wanted a comparison to like
No, absolutely.
what the casualties would mean to them.
Yeah. An estimate that has been given for the total loss of life, so not soldiers, of the German population, because the Germans faced the greatest brunt of the brutality of the war. And it is a high-end estimate. It is more than the reality. We know that. We don't know how much higher, but this is to give you a sense of how bad it was, particularly in Germany, is that over the course of the 30 Years' War, 75% of the population died. It's too high, but
To be contributed.
half of the population is too low. Somewhere between it. 1 out of every 2 and 3 out of every 4 people died over the course of the 30 Years' War in Germany. This is the German population, not counting any of the soldiers of other countries that died there. It was an extremely brutal conflict. During the worst battle, as far as devastation is concerned, it's known as the Sack of Magdeburg, which is why mid-sized metropolis, right? 80% of the population died. That's the low-end estimate. A fire broke out. Everyone was hiding in cellars to stay away, right? You put the rich stuff on the top floor. You hope the soldiers take that, don't kill you in the process, right? And you just hope to live through. But everyone was in cellars. Fire broke out in the city. Cellars turned into ovens. At least 80% of the population.
Cook everybody.
Yeah.
Well, I hope they suffocated instead of
Burned. Yeah. Either way, it's not going to be great.
Yeah.
Oh, and by the way, the 30 Years' War also coincides with an outbreak of the plague.
That's
That
so
plague,
sad. That's
Black Death. Now, granted, disease often follows conflicts. This is separate. I mean, it's extra devastating, but it did not come about in Europe as a result of the 30 Years' War. It was a whole different thing. But the Black Death breaks out again during this conflict. Interestingly enough, there's a hymn in our hymnal. We sing it every Thanksgiving. Now thank we all our God. It was written by a German pastor in the middle of this time frame. I don't remember the story exactly, but what I remember is the figure that's coming to my mind is that he wrote it after he buried about 75% of his congregation. Right after a funeral, he went and wrote "Now Thank We All Our God," which is astounding in its own right. It's a great hymn. It's a wonderful. Now every Thanksgiving you'll think about that. So in the middle of war and plague, that's what he wrote. "Now Thank We All Our God." Because of the terrors of the war and its far-reaching devastation. I'm reading my point. 30 Years' War saw the rise of print media as the first war reporting for the first time. While it was unintentional, the Treaty of Westphalia did lay the groundwork and began the process of removing religion from questions of state. Basically, what happened is European powers, not intentionally, right? They weren't thinking that they were doing this, but they began to move this direction, realized, oh man, we can't use religion as a reason to fight each other anymore, because this was really, really bad, guys. And so this also saw, again, for mostly unrelated, but also tangential reasons, the removal of clergy from state positions. Interesting enough, it also saw the rise of state churches. The difference there is who's the one that's on top of the pyramid. So there was a shift from, think about it, right? The Catholic Church, we talked about this with the Ottoman invasion, right? Who was the one that was providing all of the support for Charles to fight the Turks? Well, it was the Pope. And he was also calling a lot of the shots, right? Because he had the money and the people and the fervor, right? So the Treaty of Westphalia begins this process where that flips on its head. And we're going to talk about that a lot more, a little bit in this class, but particularly in the next class, which remind me to talk about next week. But as princes begin to make churches state departments, the Treaty of Westphalia kind of begins to do that. As I've quipped in the past, the 30 Years' War is the last war of religion in Europe, But don't worry, the Europeans found plenty of other reasons to kill each other. But this really is the last time that religion is the reason why the reason given why soldiers are fighting. It's the last time religion is the primary rhetoric of war. After this, by the way, the main thing that comes up is nationalism, right? You got to stop the French because they're the French and they're revolutionaries and they're the worst, right? Or, nationalism begins, if you will, with the end of the 30 Years' War. At least that process begins. Questions about the aftermath of the war? All right, this is a class about Lutherans, after all, so what is the impact on the Lutherans of the 30 Years' War? Well, massive devastation is one part of it. But largely the Lutherans did attempt to stay out of the conflict. Again, they had a vested interest in not fighting really anyone. But because of various political, social, and largely geographical reasons, they were constantly dragged into the fight. So it didn't matter if the Lutherans wanted to be involved in this or not, they were. And so they were fighting. But in the aftermath of this, the Lutherans became an insular group. They, generally speaking, Lutherans were done with politics. We're finished with that. We're not interested in any of it. Look at how bad it all became, right? So the Lutherans kind of shut themselves off as much as they could from the outside world, not interested in politicking and conflicts. Rather, they sought to stay to themselves. This is going to drive the second thing that we're going to talk about today, which is Lutheran Orthodoxy. So, basically, we're going to talk about, it's the second portion of the class. I say half, it's probably going to be about the next half hour, right? Lutheran Orthodoxy is driven by the sense of who is with me and who is not. And the 30 Years' War is a major driver in that. Remember, Calvinists are saying that they're Lutherans, and then they're fighting on behalf of Lutherans and that sort of thing. And so, between that and the conflicts, the Lutherans now have a very vested interest in saying who is on my side and who is not on my side. I don't care about the labels. Tell me what you believe, which is termed Lutheran Orthodoxy. And it's a large movement. It continues on into the 18th century. So we're going to talk about the Lutheran Orthodoxy again in the next class. But this is where it gets its origin. And it really is kind of a self-defense mechanism. Who's on my side? Who isn't? Who can I trust and who can't I? Who's with me? Who's against me? And the litmus test for that is doctrine, is what you believe, right? Not what you call yourself, but what you actually believe, what your confession is. By the way, in this next section, we're going to see a lot of ourselves. And I think this is a major hallmark of who Lutherans are even to this day. And this is where it comes from, at least initially. All right, questions before we conclude the 30 Years' War section. All right, so Lutheran Orthodoxy. So, due to necessity, we're kind of backing up here again. So, due to necessity, the Reformed churches began to center around the political arms of nationality. Right? So what does that word silent sentence mean? Basically, before the 30 Years' War, the Reformers recognized, again, if I can get the Prince to be on my side, call ourselves Lutherans, we'll be good. After the 30 Years' War, the way that the Reformed churches kind of moved forward was as state churches. So it's, again, kind of just that shift and that switch. The princes began to see various church organizations and clergy members as, again, part of their departments is kind of the way we would look at it, right? So it's the department of the church, basically. This is very much in its genesis in the 17th century, but we're going to see state churches being a major facet in Europe. I mean, even to this day. I mean, you go to Germany, and there's the German Lutheran Church, and that's a state church. It's a state-run organization. They get money out of taxes and all of that sort of thing. There is also the German Free Lutheran Church, for what it's worth, which is a non-state-run Lutheran church. So that's what this will lead to, although we're not quite there yet. Again, because the Peace of Augsburg only identified two possible denominations, Catholic, and they didn't call them Lutherans, they called them Augsburgs, right? Because of the confession. Yeah, right, I found it. Other Reformed groups started to latch on to that moniker, say, well, that's us. That's who we are. Again, often saying that they are the true Lutherans because they took Luther to his final conclusion. By the way, this is a claim you still hear Reformed groups making today. You often hear this around October 31st when all sorts of churches are celebrating Martin Luther. And granted, all Reformed, non-Catholic, non-Orthodox churches have some version of a Genesis in Luther. But sometimes you ask the person, well, what did Luther believe? And all of a sudden he sounds a lot like a Calvinist. And you think, well, hold on. you're missing some gaps here. So this is a phenomenon that still exists, although not to the extent that it did during the 17th century, obviously. Because their very existence and legitimacy depended on them using that name. This infiltration of Reformed and Calvinistic church bodies into the Lutheran Church, along with everything else we've talked about, drove the desire for confessionalism, right? I confess the Augsburg Confession. I confess the unaltered Augsburg Confession, right, as we discussed last week, right? I confess the Book of Concord. These are my confessions. This is what I believe. Because, quite frankly, Calvinists cannot say that they confess the Book of Concord because they don't agree with everything in the Book of Concord. And so the name became less important than the confession. And that's kind of how the distinction was made between the various groups. Additionally, and this is something that I kind of left out of the lead up to the 30 Years' War, but in the early 17th century, right around the centennial of the Reformation, the Jesuits moved into Germany to undo the Reformation, was the goal. They moved in as counter-reformers, seeking to force the reformed areas of Europe back to the Pope. So now you have another external religious pressure on what do you believe? What do you confess? Therefore, Orthodoxy was driven by both internal and external influences and threats. Does this make sense as to where Orthodoxy is coming from? All right. Technically, the Orthodox movement begins in 1580, so we got to back up a little bit, with the writing of the Book of Concord. So that's when the Formula of Concord was written and was codified, the Confessions, right? So Orthodoxy truly begins with the conclusion of the confessional era of the Lutheran Church. We were writing all of these documents. From there, even in the universities, Orthodoxy became an offshoot of theology and doctrine into the life of the Christian, right? So it doesn't matter what your prince believes, what do you believe? It doesn't matter what your pastor believes, what do you believe, right? And so Orthodoxy began to move theology out of the universities and into the life of the parishioner, into the life of the individuals, right? It sought to connect Lutherans to the confessional teachings and have them live them out in their lives as a bulwark against doctrinal opposition of the Calvinists and the Jesuits, right? So how do you keep the Lutherans Lutheran when the Calvinists are trying to make the Lutherans Calvinists and the Jesuits are trying to make the Lutherans Catholic? You make them confessional. You teach them the confessions, the beliefs, the teachings of the Lutheran Church. Then, all of this served to make Lutheran Orthodoxy a question of identity and lifestyle. So who are the Lutherans? We are the ones who confess these things. Again, sound anything familiar? I'm sure Joe's nodding his head because he's been involved in the LCMS for quite a while. We in the LCMS draw a lot of our internal culture from this. The emphasis on confessions comes out of this era, and there are more things that happen, like pietism, the Prussian Union, like everything else we're going to talk about in this class, right? That mean that 400 years later we're still really on this horse, but this is kind of where it's coming from, right? So this is why you see groups of Lutherans pop up that call themselves the Association of Confessional Lutheran Church Pastors and things like that. And they send me emails that I don't read. Not that any of them are watching, because there aren't as many of them as they think. But that was a comment for Joe, and he's laughing at himself. So, but oftentimes, whenever someone in the LCMS wants to make themselves sound very legitimate, the word confessional appears. To be fair, we are a confessional church body. There's a good reason that word appears. I've been teaching you on and off through the confessions because I believe in the confessions. They are an important part of who we are. But it's also a little bit of a buzzword for Lutherans. And it comes out of this era, right? Who are you? Are you with us or are you against us? I'm a confessional Lutheran. You're good. You're good. Right? It is kind of the sense of what's going on here. Early in the development of Orthodoxy, two new loci of teaching begin to appear. What that means is two new chapters showed up in theology textbooks. This is a fancy way of saying it. The teachings always existed, but now they get a chapter. Now they get focus and emphasis. Now people are thinking about them quite a bit. The two of them are the visible and the invisible church, and the authority of Scripture. So let's start with the second one because that one's easy. Do you believe in the Bible or not? That's more of a modern understanding. But is the source of your belief the Bible or the Bible and something else? This roots out the Catholics, by the way, because of how they confess tradition. I think there's some nuance that goes on with tradition, which they would agree with as well, but that's not what we're dealing with here. The visible and invisible church is kind of the more important one in understanding the development of Orthodoxy and what was going on in the minds of people in the 17th century. So, a quick refresher. The visible church are all those people who go to church, right? All who say that they are Christian, in this case, all who say that they are Lutheran, they are part of the visible church. Now, we understand that the invisible church is slightly different. The invisible church are all those who truly believe, right? And so the understanding here is that there are wolves in sheep's clothing. There are unbelievers masquerading as believers in the visible church. So there are false believers that are not a part of the invisible church. Now, pause this thought, just for what's worth us understanding. Everyone in this room has no capability of distinguishing between the visible and invisible church. Apart from, just to bring John's epistles in, apart from teaching what the teachers say, right? Well, if they say something that's heretical, then they are heretics.
You can tell yourself, though.
Well, right, now...
But that's it. You can't look at anybody.
The one who knows who is in the invisible church versus the visible church is God and God alone. And it is not any of our responsibility to make that distinction. So as a pastor, if someone says they're in the visible church, I trust them, right? It's not for me to be thinking, oh, is Evan really? Is Evan really in the visible, or the invisible church? He's just visible, wolf in sheep's clothing, right? No. That's not my job, nor do I have any capability of understanding that. Evan is a good, upstanding church member, so he's part of visible and invisible church. Now, that's the doctrinal part aside. What does this tell us about what the Orthodox theologians of this era are dealing with? Why do you think this would come up? Why would this be a brand new chapter in theology textbooks in the 17th century?
Because they needed a way to sort people?
Right, yeah. So this gives them a practical theological stance of, you're not really in the church because you're a Calvinist or because you're a Catholic, right? And so we're starting to see, and this, I'm not taking a firm stance for or against really any of the movements that we're going to talk about. There are some that I like, there are some that I don't like. Orthodoxy in large part is a good movement. Personal opinion, here's one of its flaws. Orthodoxy, in the way that Lutherans were doing it in the 17th century, can invoke witch hunts, right?
Oh, yeah.
We're using modern stuff. This is Red Scare kind of stuff. You got a Catholic scare, right? And really, this is theological back and forth. Now, the theology is solid, but again, this gives us insight into, well, why is this a chapter in the book now? It's like, well, they were worried about this. This is something they were concerned about. Who's really in the church and who isn't in the church? They were nervous about these sorts of things. Now, again, I think we can be sympathetic to these theologians because, remember, they're writing these textbooks as the world's burning all around them and people are dying of the plague. And they don't know if the next person to walk along and say, I'm a Lutheran, is going to kill them or not. Or I'm a Catholic or whatever. I mean, this is kind of a nightmarish time to be alive. And so we can be sympathetic to some of these foibles that they have. But we do, I mean, how did I jokingly, I did my way or the highway, right? This is the kind of the us versus them sort of thing. This is the, are you with us or are you against us? And how do we tell? And so some of these theological emphases kind of come up here.
Yeah, some of that fear is seen in the terminology. One phrase that was used against your opponent was you're a crypto-Calvinist. You're a
Right.
You're a poser.
You're snuck in. You're a Calvinist who snuck in and dressed up as a Lutheran.
Right. And if you remember in the controversies, I think we talked about two that had the word crypto. There are more in this era, more crypto ... controversies, but I have spared you of them because it was a misery for me to read through them, so I didn't want to.
The other thing is, if you weren't Orthodox, you were heterodox.
Right. So for our reminding and understanding, Orthodox is correct teaching. Heterodox is not quite right, but not quite wrong enough to kick you out. And then heretical is you're out. Right.
Us and them.
Yeah, it really is an us and them, but I'm not going to send you to hell for it. Sort of thing is going on. The heart and center of Orthodoxy and its movement was Saxony, which, if any of you know anything about the 1800s, that word will ring a bell. If you don't, wait a few weeks and we'll talk about it. It was still part of Germany.
Germany?
Yeah. After Saxony became a frequent target of Calvinist conversion, this is a place the Calvinists were particularly active, Saxony took up the banner of Orthodoxy and absolutely ran with it. The Saxon Orthodox used many means to carry their message, including treatises, polemics, and especially, and the whole reason why the reason why reserved to the 1600s I'm talking about Saxony is this. Most famously, and most especially, the Saxons used music to convey their theology, with Johann Sebastian Bach being the most famous of the Saxon Orthodox. So Bach was a part of this movement. He was a Lutheran. His personal Bible is housed in the seminary archives, but it was closed every time I tried to go see it, with his handwritten notes. It's really cool. But
where is it?
It's in St. Louis Seminary, in our library in the basement in the rare books room. But we found it in an attic in Minnesota, because that's where you find all these things.
Bach
Pretty sure it
was
was
a
next
Lutheran?
to, what was that?
Bach was a Lutheran?
Yes, he was.
He was German, right? Or...
Yeah, he was Saxon specifically, yes, German. And his music was used to promote Lutheran Orthodoxy. It's probably the most externally, at least, lasting.
I hear a lot of his hooks in the hymnals.
Yes, we use Bach a lot. Vanjie also happens to utterly love Bach and his music, and so a lot of our preludes and postludes, J.S. Bach. A lot of Lutherans really like Bach. In fact, we have...
You do.
Right, yeah, it's really good. We have whole Bach concertos at the seminary, I think 3 times a year or something like that. Yeah, we're very involved. But no, his Bible is found in like an attic in Minnesota. I'm sure it was found next to, apparently the box Horatio Nelson was standing on when he got shot at the Battle of Trafalgar was found in like the next door, I'm sure. But another attic in Minnesota. How it got there is a mystery that the world may never know. But right now it's at the seminary, so that's good.
Just wanted to hide the artifact.
Yeah, Well, it probably got passed down for a number of years, and then someone was just like, put it in a box. Box went up in an attic.
One of those people who don't know what it is.
Oh, absolutely, right? Granddad didn't tell me what was in that box, and, by the time it gets down to great-grandson, they open it up and say, J.S. Bach, I know who that is. What in the world, right? And then,
After Bach's death, he sort of fell off the radar, even in musical and things, until Mendelssohn came along and did.
I didn't have one like that.
Until Mendelssohn did the St. Matthew's Passion,
okay.
and that really was the Bach revival.
When was that? What year? Or
I don't know the exact
decade?
year. Mendelssohn is the one who sort of revived Bach and put him back on the musical agenda. Bach has basically been forgotten, and then people started researching and digging up stuff that they could find and all like that. And probably that's when the Bible got shuffled off.
Right. yeah. As a conclude, or any questions about Orthodoxy, that's basically the end of what I want to talk about here today. We got one more little section that's kind of forward-looking. All right, so as we conclude with the 17th century, I'm going to set the stage for the 18th, mostly because there's a lot of overlap. In fact, we're going to begin the 18th century in the 17th century. So it's very frustrating, right, how these people from history didn't make the lines cleanly cut at the century marks. That would have been useful for the purposes of this class, but they're just inconsiderate. I know, inconsiderate. As Orthodoxy developed into the late 17th century, a shift began, which originated in the early Enlightenment era thinking. And just you wait, I have like 2 pages of history of philosophy for next time. Oh, it's going to be good. Looking at you, Eric. There's a shift in viewing theology a shift to viewing theology as a natural science. Again, this is Enlightenment, so we're going to talk more about it. Theology became a discipline of academics and an understanding of the practical impacts of theology. Theology began to move away at this point from the universities into the day-to-day life of the individual. The hope was to make theology of practical importance for the person. So the focus moved away from orthodoxy, what you believe, into how you live. How does your orthodoxy impact your day-to-day life, right? Don't just talk the talk, I need to see you walk the walk, is kind of the idea. What you were doing, how you were living, began in certain areas to become more important than how you thought. This paired with the emphasis of Lutheran thought and movements culturally away from the universities into mission houses, which we'll talk about next time. The shift was from universities to mission houses, parish life, and publishers also began involved. And by the beginning of the 18th going into a little bit to the 18th century, in certain areas, personal piety began to be the marker of the true Lutherans rather than personal beliefs and doctrines. So at the end of the 17th century, we begin to see a movement away from what do you believe into how are you living. And that will be the major topic of our next class. Questions about this or anything we've talked about? All right, logistical note for our class, so scheduling here. Next Wednesday, we will not have class. Although I would encourage certainly everyone on this chunk of the room, although gentlemen, you can certainly come too, to join us anyway during roughly this time slot. We are having a meet and greet with the district staff that we are hosting. It is a bi-circuit meeting, so
That's right.
there's going to be at least 4 people I know that have RSVP'd from not River Cliff. But if you want to meet the district staff, the district office, what they're doing, with our new district president, all of that. Come on by. You can talk with them. Byron Ham from Hogs and Kisses is catering. So if for no other reason, come for really good food. But because of that, we will not be meeting as a class next week. I'll be here. I'll actually be over there. We'll be meeting in Stricker Hall with the district staff.
What time is that?
Oh, I should know that.
Yeah.
I say 5:30 for the meeting.
I think it was, yeah, that sounds right.
With Teresa.
Yes.
Yes.
Just tell Teresa.
Just let Teresa know. It's in the Friday News Blast, the time. I barely remember what time this class is, and I teach it. So. Yeah. Thanks, Chris.
What's it called again? The district
There's an
meeting?
official name that's really corny, but it's a meet and greet with the district staff.
Texting her.
Yeah. So,
What?
what was that?
You should come.
I'm texting her right now to RSVP.
There you go. Good stuff. The following Wednesday, so not next Wednesday, but the next Wednesday, we will meet again for the 18th century. Yeah, it'll be good stuff. We'll talk about pietism and mission work in the or not in the LCMS. LCMS doesn't exist yet in the Lutheran Church.
Can I make an announcement about Matt Wilson and where?
Oh, please do. Yeah, so Matt Wilson, who most of you know, is a son of our congregation at the seminary. He received his vicarage call this afternoon. Where was it?
Warner Robins, Georgia.
Wow.
So he'll be at Mount Calvary. We really, both Pastor Jordan and I blanked on the name of that congregation earlier today for separate reasons. Pastor Jordan and I are out Monday and Tuesday at a regional conference at Mount Calvary. So next year we'll be meeting with Matt there. I don't know if he'll be there, probably.
It sounds like a Baptist church.
Right. It's not. It's one of ours. But you know, it's like, I knew that there were hills involved in some way. But, no.
Is that where Karen Michaels' family is a pastor there?
No. Although you should double check with her because Karen Michael has like 45 family
Michael's
members.
brother is pastor of the University of Georgia Church in Athens.
Right, and her some other relation is pastor over.
Living Faith.
Thank you. I was going to just say Dregenmuller's church, but that doesn't help. So, right. So she has all sorts of relations and all sorts of different congregations. All right. Unless there are any other questions or comments, we will close here as we typically do. Oh, yes. So there are half sheets that you may have seen on your way in. That is, I mentioned them last week. These are the "What do you want to learn about?" sheets. This class is a result of one of those from Bill Art, who ran away for this class. I have to say, he better show up for this next one because I have a question for him. Which I don't, depending on how he answers, he may need to be nervous, right? It's right here on page 18 of my notes.
Okay.
Question for Bill Art. So, if you're watching the recording, Bill, you got to be here in 2 weeks because I have a question for you.
And then, then after that, we have Wednesday till the end of May.
Yeah. So next week we're off, and then we have 3 more sessions.
3 more. Okay.
It's five lessons total. All right. Well, let's close with the Lord's Prayer then. Our Father, who art in heaven,
hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen.
Thank you all. I'll see you all I'll see you in a week for the district, but I'll see you in class in 2 weeks.